He laughed as she sat in silence during their divorce hearing, convinced his lawyers would crush her. But when she handed the judge a single envelope, the room froze. Inside, a secret prenup, damning audio, and proof of hidden millions. He had mocked her until she took everything without raising her voice. The gavel hadn't even touched the block before Graham Westwood leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other with a satisfied grin. The courtroom, all marble walls and gleaming wood, reflected the power he believed he wielded. Just another boardroom. Just another deal. He adjusted his cufflinks, the subtle glint of his platinum watch catching the courtroom lights. His team of suited lawyers flanked him like loyal soldiers, whispering strategies and smug affirmations. Elena, sitting across the aisle, looked out of place in comparison. Her simple navy blue dress, her worn leather bag, her silence, it all suggested weakness. That's what Graham saw anyway. And what Graham saw was, to him, all that mattered. He hadn't even looked at her directly until the judge entered. That was Graham's style. Cold dismissal, letting others feel the chill of being beneath his notice. He hadn't spoken to Elena in person for months. Everything went through legal channels, emails, documentation, formalities. She had insisted on coming today, though, and he was almost glad. He wanted her to see the machine he had built. The polished courtroom, the sharp-tongued lawyers, the sheer control he had over his environment. He wanted her to feel outmatched. And most of all, he wanted her to feel foolish. When the hearing began, Graham's lead attorney spoke with the confidence of a man billing by the minute and savoring every one. "Your Honor," he said, "it is our position that Mrs. Westwood's financial demands are excessive and unsupported by the evidence." He gestured to a sleek binder, one of many, that outlined Elena's comfortable lifestyle, all funded, of course, by the empire Graham had created. Photos of lavish vacations, designer handbags, charity galas. A carefully curated narrative. A woman who had lived well off her husband's brilliance and now expected more than she deserved. Graham's gaze flicked briefly to Elena, curious if she would crumble, if the pressure would finally crack her composure. But she sat still, her expression unreadable, her eyes never meeting his. She didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. Even when his lawyer casually suggested that Elena had benefited from a lifestyle she did not contribute to building, she didn't blink. Instead, she opened her bag with careful, deliberate motions and placed a thick, white envelope on the table in front of her. The room didn't notice at first. The judge asked a procedural question. Another attorney made a comment about joint property, but Elena calmly slid the envelope forward until it was within the judge's reach and said, softly but clearly, "Your Honor, I believe this may clarify my position." Graham straightened, slightly, suddenly less amused. The judge opened the envelope, expecting perhaps another last-minute affidavit. What he found, however, caused his eyebrows to lift. He pulled out a sealed thumb drive, a notarized document, and a printed letter. The courtroom fell into a hush. He scanned the contents in silence, flipping a few pages, then paused, completely still for several long seconds. Finally, he looked up, eyes focused not on Graham, but on Elena. "Ms. Westwood, may I ask where you obtained this material?" the judge asked, his voice lower, controlled. "From my personal records and legally obtained sources," she replied, her voice steady. "My legal counsel is prepared to confirm their authenticity." Graham felt something shift. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. "We weren't informed of any new evidence," he hissed. "We need to request a recess." But the judge didn't wait for them to catch up. "We're going to pause proceedings," he announced. "I will need time to review this submission in full. We'll resume in 30 minutes. The gavel echoed across the courtroom. The lawyers immediately erupted into motion. Graham's team scrambled, flipping through files, demanding to see what was in the envelope. But Elena remained seated, hands folded neatly on the table. Graham, still stunned, leaned over to his attorney. "What the hell is in that envelope?" His lawyer shook his head. "I don't know yet." But the judge's reaction wasn't good. "We'll find out." Graham stood up slowly, his ego no longer quite as inflated. For the first time in years, uncertainty prickled at the edge of his confidence. He looked across the room again, but this time, Elena's eyes met his. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at him as if she had known this moment would come all along. He opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe just to draw breath, but she turned away before he could say a word. In the hallway outside the courtroom, his lawyer was already on the phone. Graham stalked past them and out onto the balcony overlooking the courthouse gardens. He needed air. The sky was gray, the wind sharp. For some reason, the cold bit deeper than it had that morning. He stared down at the neatly trimmed hedges, fists clenched in his pockets. The sealed envelope haunted him. What could she possibly have? Had he missed something? He thought back. Their prenup, he'd had it reviewed years ago. She'd never contested it. Offshore accounts, those were protected, weren't they? He had always been careful. Always. So what did she find? And how? Inside, Elena sat with her lawyer, calm as ever. She was not celebrating. Not yet. But there was a quiet resolve in her posture, the kind that had been building for years, unacknowledged, growing in the shadow of Graham's neglect. The moment he had humiliated her in that courtroom, dismissing her life, their history, her sacrifices, he had sealed his fate. She had known that one day he would cross the line, and she had been ready. As the minutes ticked by, Graham's world, once perfectly ordered, perfectly controlled, began to feel like a structure built on sand. And something in his gut told him it had only just begun to shift. Before we dive into what happens next, tell me this. If you were in Elena's shoes, would you have done the same? Drop your thoughts in the comments and give this story a rating from 0 to 10. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Your support helps keep this channel alive and growing. Graham Westwood had always believed the world bent to those who bent it first. His empire wasn't built on compassion or patience, but on timing, charm, and an unrelenting ability to spot weakness in others. He rose through the tech industry not as a pioneer, but as a predator, acquiring, absorbing, eliminating. His portfolio stretched across continents. His name whispered in luxury lounges and high-stakes investor calls, and every boardroom he walked into quieted, not out of respect, but out of fear. He liked that. He fed on it. And for years, Elena had been part of the furniture in that world, a quiet supporter in the background, always there but rarely acknowledged. He hadn't always been this way. There had been a time, during their early years, when he was hungry but human, ambitious but attentive. He used to bring her late-night coffee during her thesis deadlines, used to stroke her hair and whisper that they'd build something together. Back then, they lived in a one-bedroom apartment with mismatched furniture and more bills than cash. Elena had believed in him. She had believed they were a team. But somewhere between the second round of funding and the private jet to Tokyo, Graham began to believe the illusion that success came from him and him alone. The shift was gradual. At first, he stopped asking her opinion on business matters. Then he started forgetting her birthday, rescheduling dinners, traveling without notice. He justified it all. He was building something important, something that would secure their future. Elena, ever patient, ever composed, didn't protest. She adapted. She managed the household, raised their daughter, supported his ambitions in silence. She put aside her own career, her own aspirations, so he could shine. And for a while, she didn't regret it. But Graham didn't notice sacrifice. He only noticed spotlight. And when Elena faded into the background, he replaced her with noise, faster cars, younger women, louder parties. One of them, Savannah Cross, slinked into his life like smoke, soft-spoken and sharp. She was everything Elena wasn't anymore. Spontaneous, flirtatious, eager to please. To Graham, she was a trophy, a compliment to his success. He didn't care that she barely understood his work or that she asked the same questions twice. She looked good in photos, and that was enough. The affair started with a harmless drink, evolved into whispers in hotel elevators, and ended in a bold ultimatum from Savannah. I won't be your secret forever. And Graham, arrogant and blind, thought letting go of Elena would be a formality. He had expected drama, of course, tears, emotional outbursts, maybe a scandalous tabloid headline or two. What he got instead was unnerving silence. Elena didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply asked for her space, her dignity, and a fair share. That infuriated him more than if she had screamed. His lawyers had prepared him for the divorce to be clean, and by clean, they meant advantageous. The prenup had been written a decade ago, tucked away like a dusty contract he assumed would never matter. Back then, Graham hadn't been this rich. Back then, Elena's father, an old-school accountant with a suspicious eye, had insisted on a clause protecting her if Graham ever committed financial fraud or failed to disclose assets. Graham signed it reluctantly, never imagining it would matter. It was a relic of a more humble era. Forgotten, or so he thought. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Graham's focus was entirely elsewhere. He hosted Savannah at a private vineyard in Bordeaux, laughing with venture capitalists over tastings of wines older than his marriage. He closed a billion-dollar deal with a Hong Kong robotics firm, streamed live on a yacht, the press calling him a tech visionary. He never read the detailed reports his legal team sent about Elena's requests. To him, she was a non-threat, a mere speed bump in his otherwise accelerating life. The day before the hearing, he lounged in his penthouse suite, glass of scotch in hand, the city blinking beneath him. Savannah pranced out of the bedroom in one of his shirts, barefoot, her hair still damp from a shower. She curled into him, smiling. "You're not nervous, are you?" she purred. He smirked. "About Elena? Please. My lawyers will handle it. She'll walk away with what's fair. That's it." Savannah bit her lip, tilting her head. "You sure she doesn't want to make trouble? I mean, you left her, right?" Graham shrugged. "She can want whatever she wants. Doesn't mean she'll get it." He didn't notice Savannah's expression falter. She knew how men like Graham worked. Confident until they weren't. She had seen it before, too much swagger and not enough sense. But she was smart enough not to say it aloud. Not yet. The morning of the hearing, Graham entered the courthouse like a man entering a press conference. His lawyers were on both sides, tie perfectly knotted, his skin bronzed from a recent getaway. Elena stood by the door, greeting her attorney with a soft nod, no theatrics. She looked thinner, he noticed, and something else, still. There was a strange calm about her, as if she had already won something. That irritated him. During the proceedings, Graham tuned out most of what was said. He watched the judge more than the arguments, gauging reactions, looking for signs of favor. He barely listened to Elena's lawyer. His mind was elsewhere, on upcoming product launches and strategic takeovers. He texted Savannah under the table. But when Elena slid the sealed envelope across the table, something in the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. No gasps, no cries. Just stillness. The judge's hand stopped moving. His mouth tightened. Graham's lead attorney leaned forward. "What is that?" he whispered. Elena's lawyer remained silent. The judge requested a recess. And that's when it hit Graham. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't in any of the scenarios he'd considered. Elena had been silent, yes, but not passive. She'd been watching, waiting, building something. For the first time in a very long time, Graham Westwood felt the cold edge of doubt slide under his skin. Outside the courtroom, he paced. His lawyers buzzed around him, speculating, spiraling. It could be tax records, one muttered, or private communications, another said. She may have found a loophole in the prenup. If there's evidence of fraud, stop, Graham snapped. She doesn't have anything. She's bluffing. But his voice lacked its usual certainty. He tried to call Savannah. No answer. He messaged her again. "Update you soon. Nothing to worry about." But even as he typed it, his hand trembled slightly. His empire, once a monument to unshakable confidence, had begun to flicker. He looked through the courthouse window, down at Elena. She was talking to her lawyer, smiling faintly. Not the smile of someone hoping to win, but of someone who already knew how this would end. And that terrified him more than he could admit. Elena didn't need the spotlight to make her move. That was something Graham never understood about her. He believed power was always loud. Executive meetings, magazine covers, headlines that announced your arrival before you walked through a door. But Elena had always operated in silence, letting others underestimate her. That was her strength. She listened. She watched. And most of all, she remembered. For years, she'd lived quietly behind the noise of Graham's rise, supporting from the sidelines, absorbing the shifting winds of his ambition, even as he started to vanish from their shared life. He didn't notice when she stopped asking about his schedule, when she stopped planning dinner, or when her presence in their shared bed became a rare occurrence. That suited her. She needed the distance. She needed space to think. After their separation, Elena moved into a modest apartment on the east side of the city. It wasn't anything close to the penthouse she once called home, but she didn't miss the floor-to-ceiling windows or the cold marble floors. Her new space was warm, cluttered with books, plants, and quiet evenings. She returned to teaching part-time at a local college, instructing undergraduates on finance ethics, a subject she once believed in deeply, back before Graham's empire had made a mockery of it. Her students liked her. They saw her as patient, insightful, and oddly powerful, even if she never raised her voice. But she never spoke about her former life. To them, she was just Professor Westwood. One night, after class, she stayed behind in her office, sorting through a stack of midterms. The room was dim, the only light a small desk lamp. The city's glow bled through the blinds and stripes. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A name appeared on the screen she hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. Margot Chen. Elena hesitated, then answered. Elena, Margot said, her voice low and cautious. I heard about the divorce. Is it true? Yes, Elena replied, calm and composed. It's been coming for a while. There was a pause on the line. Then Margot spoke again, this time slower. Are you ready to use what we talked about? Elena exhaled. I think it's time. They met the next day at a quiet cafe tucked away in a side street, the kind of place Graham would never notice. Margot walked in wearing her usual black coat, her hair pulled into a sharp bun, her expression unreadable. She had been a financial analyst at one of Graham's former partner firms before quietly exiting after what she described as a disagreement in ethics. Back then, she had approached Elena not as a whistleblower, but as a friend who couldn't stay silent. She had warned Elena about the shell companies, the creative accounting, the hidden streams of wealth routed through offshore accounts. Elena had thanked her, but at the time, she wasn't ready. Now she was. I've kept everything, Margot said as they sat down. The files, the recordings, even the contract amendments Graham thought he buried. I knew one day you'd need them. Elena reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Margot's. You have no idea how much this means. Margot smiled faintly. Actually, I do. Later that night, Elena sat alone in her apartment, the files spread out on her dining table. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Line after line of transactions moved before her eyes. Some in the Caymans, others routed through Luxembourg. Names she didn't recognize attached to bank accounts that led back, again and again, to Westwood Global. Some of the entries were from years ago, masked beneath false consulting fees or overseas investment claims. But the signatures, she recognized those. Graham's arrogance had made him careless. He never thought she would look this closely. He never thought she would care. But she did. And then there was the recording. She listened to it twice, just to be sure. Graham's voice, unmistakably his, casual and cruel. It's just paperwork. Nobody reads the fine print. Especially not her. We'll bury it with enough legal jargon, and by the time she notices, I'll be on a yacht in Santorini. He laughed, then added, besides, the prenup's useless. The copy she had disappeared years ago. She's got nothing. Elena paused the recording and stared at the wall for a long time. The prenup. He thought it was gone. Years ago, after her father passed, she had moved boxes of family documents to storage. In the months after Graham began pulling away, she had started to search. Slowly, meticulously. And last month, in a safety deposit box marked under her father's name, she found it. The original, signed prenup, with the special clause her father had insisted on including. It was intact, legally valid, and Graham's actions had triggered it in full. The clause was simple. If the signing party is found to have intentionally hidden or misrepresented any personal or corporate financial assets at the time of divorce, the agreement shall revert all marital holdings to the claimant. In layman's terms, if he lied, she got everything. Elena sat back, stunned not by what she had, but by how long it had taken for this moment to arrive. She had never wanted revenge. Not really. She didn't crave his humiliation or his downfall. But she had always wanted one thing, dignity, a voice, control over the life she had helped build and watched be stripped from her inch by inch. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, she worked in silence. Her lawyer, an old friend from her university days, helped her piece together the documents. Margot verified the data and provided a sworn affidavit. They built their case with surgical precision. There were no threats, no warnings. She gave Graham every opportunity to play fair. He didn't take it. And now, Elena had no intention of warning him about the storm coming his way. The day before the hearing, she stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the front of her dress. It wasn't expensive, but it was sharp. Her reflection stared back, clear-eyed, composed. different than the woman who had once tiptoed around a powerful man's moods. She thought of their daughter, who was away at school, unaware of the war unfolding behind the scenes. Elena had shielded her from it all. She always would. That morning, as she walked through the courthouse doors, a single phrase repeated in her mind like a mantra. This is not revenge. This is correction. The difference mattered. She was not here to destroy. She was here to reclaim. Graham had walked into that courtroom believing she was weak, bitter, irrelevant. And that, Elena thought, was the most powerful mistake he had ever made. Elena never liked secrets. She was raised in a household where truth was spoken plainly, where her father used to say, "Honesty may not win you applause, but it always buys you sleep." That sentiment followed her into adulthood, into marriage, even when she quietly let go of her career to support Graham's. She had been transparent about her dreams, her fears, her needs. But Graham, over the years, became a man who traded in shadows. The bigger his business grew, the more secrets he learned to keep, each buried beneath layers of charm and deniability. Elena didn't know when exactly his integrity slipped, but she knew it was gone by the time he started using phrases like offshore diversification with a smirk. Margot helped her peel back the curtain. They met again in Elena's apartment, the table cluttered with files, laptops, and strong coffee. The walls were plastered with sticky notes and timelines. Margot worked methodically, her fingers dancing across spreadsheets and encrypted folders. Every click revealed more rot beneath the surface. Graham was smart, Margot admitted, but not careful. He thought hiding money offshore made him untouchable. What he didn't understand is that digital footprints never vanish. They only wait. One by one, they traced the flow of money. Millions funneled into shell companies registered under fabricated names, then routed through holding firms with vague, sanitized labels. There were irregularities in tax filings, forged signatures on transfer documents, and unexplained payments to third-party consultants in jurisdictions notorious for financial secrecy. Elena read each line of data like a novel she couldn't stop turning. Not because she enjoyed it, but because it painted a portrait of a man she once trusted, one deceit at a time. The wealth he claimed to have earned with grit and ingenuity was built partially on deception, and now she had the proof. Late one evening, Margot leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "You realize this goes beyond divorce court, right?" she said. "If you take this public or legal, he's facing more than just losing assets. He could lose everything." Elena nodded slowly. "That's not my decision. That's the court's." She wasn't after ruin. She didn't want to see Graham in prison. She wanted truth to stand beside her when she faced the judge, and she wanted the balance to tip back toward what was fair. "I don't want revenge," she added, "but I won't protect a lie." Margot reached into her briefcase and slid over a thumb drive. "This is everything. Audio recordings, transfer logs, emails. It's all in here. Password protected. Give it to your lawyer when you're ready." Elena took it with both hands, as if it weighed more than it did. She turned it over in her fingers, thinking about the first time she saw Graham close a deal, how proud she had been. And now, all of that brilliance felt like it had been spent on hiding instead of building. A few nights later, Elena stood in the rain outside the bank where her father's old safety deposit box was held. The city buzzed behind her, unaware of the turning point she had reached. Inside the sterile vault room, she slid open the metal drawer with a trembling hand and pulled out the envelope. It was exactly where she had left it. She opened it slowly, revealing the crisp prenup and her father's notations in the margins. The clause was highlighted in faded yellow, but the ink was clear. Fraud nullifies the agreement. Total asset transfer to Elena in the event of financial deception. It was airtight, ironclad, and now enforceable. She sat on her couch that night holding both the prenup and the thumb drive, staring into the quiet space she'd built for herself. Her heart was pounding, not out of fear, but out of a sense of gravity. Everything Graham had thought was hidden was now illuminated. He didn't just lose control, he lost the illusion that he ever had it. She placed both items into a sealed envelope, labeled it for her attorney, and breathed for the first time in days. The next morning, she called her lawyer. "I have something," she said plainly. "It's time." In a different part of the city, Graham was pouring champagne into Savannah's glass, lounging on a rooftop terrace surrounded by executives who laughed too loudly and stayed too long. His phone buzzed, and he ignored it. He had won a new contract, another partnership, another inflated headline in a tech publication. He leaned into Savannah and whispered, "You know, I think I finally understand what freedom feels like." She smiled at him, but something in her eyes flickered. She hadn't asked about the divorce hearing. She hadn't cared enough. And Graham, drunk on the illusion of control, didn't notice the silence. Back in her lawyer's office, Elena slid the envelope across the polished desk. Her attorney opened it and stared for a long moment before exhaling a soft, disbelieving laugh. "He's done," she said simply. Elena didn't smile. "Don't gloat," she replied. "Just prepare." Her attorney nodded. "We'll file the motion immediately. The judge will see this before the hearing resumes." Elena rose from her chair, smoothed her coat, and left without looking back. Outside, the city moved as it always did, indifferent, chaotic, endless. But something had shifted. For the first time since the separation, she didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was directing. She was no longer the woman waiting in the wings of Graham's story. She was the author now. That night, as she lay in bed, sleep eluded her. Not out of worry, but out of anticipation. She stared at the ceiling, imagining Graham's face when the judge opened that envelope. She didn't want him to suffer, but she needed him to see her, not as the quiet wife in the corner, not as the woman who smiled through his betrayals, but as the woman who had watched, waited, and built her strategy in silence. And when morning came, the courtroom wouldn't be the only place where the truth would rise. Elena whispered into the quiet, "You taught me how to play the game, Graham. You just never imagined I'd learn how to win it." The morning of the continuation hearing, Elena arrived at the courthouse alone. Her lawyer was already inside, preparing the supplemental materials for the judge. The air was cool and damp, the city still shaking off the fog of dawn. She paused at the courthouse steps, one hand resting on the strap of her purse, the other curled around a warm cup of tea she had barely touched. She watched the slow shuffle of people going in and out of the building. Security guards, janitors, early attorneys. All of them unaware that, inside that envelope her lawyer now carried, lay the quiet dismantling of a man who thought himself untouchable. As she climbed the steps, a memory from years ago surfaced. Her father, standing in their old kitchen, a weathered copy of a legal document in his hands, saying, "I know you love him, Elena. I know you think he's the one. But no matter how much you trust someone, you protect yourself. Because the man you marry today might not be the man standing beside you 10 years from now." She had been annoyed then, even hurt. But she had signed the document he presented, more to appease him than out of concern. Graham hadn't liked the idea of a prenup. It had wounded his pride. But he'd been younger then, less calculating, still chasing her approval. He had signed it with a laugh, calling it a formality for the pessimistic. She remembered the pen he used, one of her father's. She remembered the way he joked about hiding it in a drawer, how she filed it away later, how over the years she had assumed it was lost. But it wasn't, and neither was the clause her father had insisted on adding. Tucked near the bottom of the document, in language dry and exact, was the linchpin of everything that now hung in the balance. A stipulation rarely seen in standard agreements, but perfectly legal. If one party is found to have hidden assets or engaged in financial deception during the course of the marriage, the contract is voided and full asset control reverts to the aggrieved party. Elena had barely remembered it, until she listened to the audio recording of Graham boasting to his associate about how she'd never find the original. The idea that he truly believed she was that naive still made her chest tighten. He had buried the document in his mind, confident that time and power would erase the past. But what he hadn't considered was that Elena had never forgotten anything. Not the way he shifted after his third investment round. Not the late-night phone calls that weren't business. Not the change in his voice when he spoke to her, clipped and dismissive, like a man speaking to an employee he couldn't fire. She had watched it all, absorbed every moment, and remembered. And she had kept that document, not out of vengeance, but out of instinct. A quiet voice inside her that whispered, "One day, this will matter." Inside the courtroom, Graham was already seated, surrounded by his legal team, their laptops open, their expressions tense. Gone was the smug detachment of the previous hearing. His tie was tighter, his jaw more set. Savannah was nowhere to be seen. Elena noticed. She always noticed. When she entered, he glanced at her only once, then looked away. She saw the flicker of discomfort in his posture, the way his hands moved restlessly over the edge of the table. He hadn't slept well. That much was obvious. She hoped, in a quiet way, that it was the beginning of something new for him, an understanding of consequence. The judge entered. The bailiff called the court to order. Everyone stood. Then, as they sat again, the judge cleared his throat and lifted a stapled set of documents from his bench. "Before we continue," he said, "I have reviewed new materials submitted by Mrs. Westwood's counsel. These include a notarized prenuptial agreement and supplementary financial documents indicating potential fraud. I must say this is significant." Graham shifted in his seat. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering something urgent. Elena sat still, her face unreadable, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The judge continued, his voice calm but firm. "This clause," he said, lifting the prenup, "effectively grants Mrs. Westwood full control of all marital assets upon confirmation of financial misconduct. Given the materials provided, including authenticated recordings and a verified paper trail, I am inclined to treat this as grounds for immediate reevaluation of the asset division." Graham stood abruptly. "Your Honor, that document was from years ago. It's irrelevant. She doesn't have the right." "Sit down, Mr. Westwood," the judge said without raising his voice. "You'll have time to respond, but I suggest you choose your words very carefully moving forward." Graham sat, seething. His lawyer scrambled through folders, clearly unprepared. Across from him, Elena remained as she had been, still, composed, and entirely unaffected by his unraveling. The judge turned to her. "Mrs. Westwood, your attorney will need to formally submit this evidence into record, and the court will require confirmation of the document's chain of custody." "She's prepared," Elena replied, her voice clear. "All the paperwork is in order." A short silence followed. Then the judge leaned back in his chair. "Very well. We'll recess for an hour. When we return, I'll hear both sides regarding this development." As the courtroom emptied, Graham didn't move. He sat staring straight ahead, his thoughts clearly spiraling. His empire, his carefully cultivated image, had just cracked in public view. His lawyer spoke to him in hurried bursts, but he didn't respond. Elena walked past him on her way out. She didn't look at him, didn't slow her step. But he turned toward her, his voice low, bitter. "You were never this smart before." She paused only long enough to glance over her shoulder and say, "Maybe you were never really looking." Out in the hallway, her lawyer caught up with her. "They'll stall, try to poke holes, maybe even challenge the prenup's validity. But it won't work. You've got him, Elena." Elena nodded. "We don't gloat. We proceed." Her lawyer smiled. "You always were the calm one." "I learned it by watching him," she replied. As she stepped outside into the brisk afternoon, she drew in a long breath. The courthouse, the hearing, the documents, they were all part of something larger. This wasn't about revenge. This was about recognition. This was about finally being heard in a language Graham understood: paper, proof, and power. And as she walked away from the building, the weight she carried wasn't fear or uncertainty, it was momentum. The hour recess passed with the kind of strained silence that only exists in rooms too full of unspoken fears. Graham sat in the side conference chamber with his lawyers, but his focus had fractured. His lead counsel, a sharp-tongued man named Avery Grant, paced in front of him with mounting agitation. "The judge is taking this seriously," he muttered, flipping through the newly filed documents. "This isn't some stunt. The clause is real, the evidence is damning, and unless we discredit the materials, you're in real trouble." Graham ran a hand through his hair, the strands sticking up from stress. His mind kept returning to the envelope. How could she have found the prenup? He remembered hiding it, or at least assuming it had vanished in the shuffle of years and moves and mergers. And those recordings, he barely remembered them. The words weren't even malicious, just careless. He hadn't known she was still paying attention, hadn't thought she'd build a case behind his back while pretending to disappear. She was supposed to fade, but now she was glowing. He looked at the wall clock. 5 minutes until the hearing resumed. 5 minutes until the world that bore his name started slipping away. Across the hall, Elena stood with her lawyer, reviewing the outline of their response. She looked like someone walking into a lecture hall, not a courtroom. Collected, clear-eyed. Every corner of her posture said, "I'm not here to beg. I'm here to end this." The bailiff called the room to order once again. Graham entered last this time, no longer the center of gravity in the room. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since his earliest startup pitch rejections. But this wasn't a venture. This was his legacy, his identity, on trial in front of a judge who now viewed him less as a charismatic success story and more as a man with something to hide. Court is back in session, the judge announced. Before we proceed with the final determination of marital asset division, I would like to hear from both parties regarding the newly submitted materials. Mr. Grant, you may begin. Avery stood, voice measured but tight. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the existence of the prenup, we must express serious concern about the authenticity of the supplemental evidence presented. Audio recordings, when provided without chain of custody documentation or forensic verification, cannot be treated as uncontested fact. Furthermore, the financial records, while thorough, were obtained through unnamed sources. We request additional time to investigate the validity of these materials. The judge narrowed his eyes. Your client had ample opportunity to disclose his full financial history. Mrs. Westwood's counsel has already submitted notarized affidavits regarding the evidence's origin, and the document in question was recovered from a verified deposit box under her late father's name. You'll need more than vague objections, Mr. Grant. Avery hesitated. We believe the intent behind the clause is being interpreted too broadly. The language is ambiguous. Financial deception can encompass a wide spectrum of behaviors. The judge didn't flinch. Your client failed to disclose multiple offshore accounts. That is not ambiguous. Graham clenched his jaw. He could feel the back of his neck burning as whispers broke out among the observers in the gallery. A few members of the press were seated toward the back, scribbling notes, watching him like hawks circling an injured animal. He recognized one of them from a business feature interview he gave the previous year. Now, she was watching him with an entirely different lens. Mrs. Westwood, the judge continued, your statement? Elena stood. She didn't raise her voice, didn't fill the room with theatrical emotion. She simply spoke as if she were explaining an equation. My client, myself, acted in good faith throughout the marriage. I was not involved in his financial dealings, nor did I interfere with his companies. I relied on our legal agreement to protect my interests. That agreement was dismissed by my husband, both in spirit and in practice. He told others it didn't matter, that I would never find it, that I didn't matter. A low rustle spread through the courtroom. Elena didn't pause. The prenup was not written in malice. It was drafted by my father, a cautious man who believed in fairness, not revenge. It protected me from this exact scenario. And now, I am asking the court to honor it. She sat down without a glance toward Graham. He stared at her profile, trying to match this composed woman to the version of her he'd grown used to ignoring. He couldn't. The two weren't the same. The judge reviewed a few more documents, then looked up slowly. Given the clarity of the clause and the corroborating evidence, I will be issuing a preliminary order to freeze the contested assets under Mrs. Westwood's control until a final ruling is delivered. Additionally, I am referring elements of this case to the district's Financial Crimes Division for review. The courtroom fell dead silent. Graham's breath caught in his throat. You're freezing my assets? He asked, not hiding the disbelief in his voice. Until the matter is resolved, the judge said, tone firm. You may not sell, transfer, or restructure any holdings. Further violations will be considered contempt. Graham turned to his lawyer. This can't be happening. It is, Avery whispered, unable to sugarcoat the blow. And it's only the beginning. Elena stood once more. Your Honor, I'd also like to formally decline any alimony. I'm not seeking financial support. I'm only requesting what I am legally entitled to. Nothing more. The judge nodded. Request noted. We'll reconvene in 1 week with a full financial summary and verification of asset holdings. This session is adjourned. As the gavel struck, Graham sat in stunned silence. Around him, people moved, papers shuffled, lawyers murmured. But all he could hear was the echo of his own arrogance collapsing into silence. He had expected to destroy her in that courtroom. Instead, she'd handed him a mirror. Elena gathered her things, not rushing, not lingering. As she walked past him, she didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply existed with a weight that filled the room, a quiet finality that Graham couldn't look away from. He didn't rise. He couldn't. because deep down, he understood that the sealed envelope was never the beginning. It was the end of the illusion that she was powerless, the end of the myth that money could buy silence, the end of his certainty that he was always the smartest one in the room. The news didn't take long to spread. By the time Graham left the courthouse, his name was already trending, not for a new product launch or a record-breaking acquisition, but for something far less curated. Tech mogul accused of financial fraud. Divorce hearing reveals hidden offshore accounts. Prenup clause flips control to ex-wife. Headlines screamed from glowing screens and buzzing phones. Journalists circling like flies, eager for the fall of a man who had once appeared invincible. Graham pushed through the crowd, ignoring the rapid-fire questions and flashing cameras, his silence doing little to temper the storm. He had always courted attention. Now, it was suffocating. The black car waiting for him at the curb pulled away fast, but not fast enough. A young reporter shouted as they pulled off, "Mr. Westwood, are you losing everything?" He didn't answer, but the question followed him all the way home. Savannah was waiting in the penthouse when he arrived. The space that once felt like a symbol of dominance now echoed with discomfort. She stood by the window in an elegant robe, phone in hand, scanning the news alerts. When he stepped inside, she turned to him slowly, her face unreadable. "It's everywhere," she said. "Even the financial blogs are running it." Graham tossed his jacket onto the couch and loosened his tie, tension clinging to his skin like humidity. "It's a smear job," he said, though even he didn't believe it. She twisted it, blew it out of proportion. Savannah raised an eyebrow. "She didn't twist your voice on that recording. You said those things, Graham. And if even half of this evidence is legit, you're in more than just trouble." He poured himself a drink with trembling hands. "I'll recover. I always do." She stepped closer. "You don't get it. This isn't a PR issue. This is the kind of thing investors run from. Banks freeze accounts. Boards lose confidence. You're not untouchable anymore." Graham didn't respond. He stared into his glass like it might offer a solution. "It'll blow over. It always does." But she was already walking away. "Maybe, but I'm not sticking around to find out." Her words hit like a slap, casual in tone but final in impact. "I have no intention of becoming collateral in your downfall." He watched her disappear down the hallway, her suitcase already packed. She didn't slam the door. She didn't need to. The quiet thud of it closing felt louder than anything that had happened in court. In the days that followed, the headlines only sharpened. Business partners distanced themselves. Shareholders began making noise. One of his board members, a longtime ally, issued a formal statement announcing an emergency meeting to reassess executive leadership. Clients canceled calls. Emails went unanswered. What once felt like a kingdom now resembled a crumbling castle. And no matter how many damage control meetings he held, no one seemed willing to look him in the eye. He sat in his office, watching the value of his company plummet in real time on the stock ticker. Every minute brought new losses, every hour a new blow. Elena hadn't said a word to the press. She hadn't needed to. The documents and recordings had done all the talking, and the silence on her part only added to the dignity of her stance. She wasn't playing the media game. She wasn't performing vengeance. She was letting the truth walk on its own 2 feet, and it walked fast. His legal team tried to push back. They filed motions, challenged the validity of the prenup, even tried to imply that Elena had obtained the evidence illegally. But the court wasn't buying it. The judge ordered a full financial audit, and with every stone overturned, more shadows were exposed. Things Graham hadn't thought twice about: creative accounting choices, one-time write-offs, offshore reinvestments, were now being scrutinized under a forensic microscope. The walls were closing in, and no amount of bravado could slow it down. He received a call one evening from his CFO. "I'm sorry, Graham," the man said, voice low, almost ashamed. "The board voted unanimously. You're being removed as CEO. Effective immediately." Graham leaned back in his chair, a stunned silence swallowing him whole. "You're firing me from my own company?" "We're preserving what's left," the CFO said. "The brand can't survive if your name stays attached. It's already bleeding." He didn't argue. He just hung up and sat there, staring at the city skyline that once bowed to his ambition. Lights flickered across glass towers. Cars crawled below. Life moved on, unmoved by the collapse of one man's ego. The penthouse was quiet. Empty. No Savannah. No staff. No power meetings or late-night calls to Tokyo. Just silence and the growing weight of a reputation undone. That night, for the first time in years, he walked through the penthouse with no agenda. He stopped in the hallway where the family photos used to hang. Most had been taken down after Elena left. But one remained, a forgotten frame tucked behind a bookshelf. It showed a younger version of himself, arms around Elena and their daughter, back when his eyes still held softness. He stared at it for a long time, unable to look away. Somewhere along the line, he had traded warmth for worship, loyalty for leverage. And now, the altar of his empire was empty. He poured another drink, sat down on the leather sofa, and for once, didn't check his phone. He didn't draft a plan. He didn't rehearse his next move. Because there was nothing to prepare for. Elena had already moved the final piece on the board, and the game was no longer his to play. The headlines would keep spinning. The financial agencies would keep probing. His name would fade from innovation lists and be replaced by cautionary tales. But none of that haunted him as much as the memory of Elena, walking past him in the courtroom, not with triumph, but with something far worse, clarity. She hadn't destroyed him. She had revealed him. And now, all that was left was to sit in the ruins of what he thought he built and realize it had never truly been his to begin with. Savannah always thought she was in control. From the moment she met Graham at that industry gala, with his custom-tailored tuxedo and effortless charm, she had seen the opportunity behind the man. Not the man himself, of course. Graham Westwood wasn't the kind of person who invited emotional attachment, but the lifestyle he offered, the proximity to power, the curated identity of being seen as the partner of a man who always won. She had slipped into his world like it was custom designed for her. Lavish vacations, invitations to exclusive events, credit cards with no limits, and a penthouse where sunlight spilled across floors made of stone more expensive than her parents' house. She learned quickly that Graham liked admiration, silence when he spoke, and presence without pressure. Savannah was good at all of that, until the day she wasn't. She had watched the courtroom drama unfold from a careful distance. Graham hadn't invited her to attend the hearings, and she hadn't insisted. It didn't bother her at first. She told herself it was a formality, a loose end from his past. But when the headlines exploded and the sealed envelope became the centerpiece of the narrative, her patience thinned. The asset freeze, the fraud implications, the hidden offshore accounts. The woman he dismissed had not only fought back, she had humiliated him. And now, everything Savannah had tied herself to was unraveling. At first, she waited for Graham to explain, to call, to tell her everything was being twisted by lawyers and journalists. But the phone stayed silent longer than she liked. And when she finally called him, the man who answered sounded different. Not angry, not scared, but smaller, reduced, like someone trying to remember how it felt to be important. "Are we okay?" she had asked. "We're fine," he muttered. "Just stay put. I'll figure this out." That wasn't good enough. Savannah had been around men like Graham long enough to recognize a shift in currency. Power was no longer his to give, and that meant her place beside him was no longer secure. So she started asking around. Quietly, she spoke to a friend in finance, someone who worked at a firm Graham used to partner with. What she heard chilled her. "He's radioactive," the friend said. "No one's going to touch him. Not after this. The audits are only the beginning." Still, Savannah returned to the penthouse, hoping for reassurance. The place felt different, emptier, colder, like something vital had been extracted. Graham sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, still in the same clothes from the hearing, drink in hand, staring at nothing. She stood across from him, waiting, but he didn't even look up. "I want to know what's next," she said, folding her arms. He blinked slowly, then muttered, "You should probably start packing." Savannah's jaw tightened. "Excuse me. This place will be hers in a few weeks. They froze the accounts. Legal says she'll have full access soon. I'm just waiting for the final blow." "So that's it?" Savannah asked. "You lose once, and I'm out." Graham turned to her then, eyes bloodshot but sharp. "Don't act surprised. This was never forever. You knew that." She did. Deep down she did. But she hated hearing it aloud. "You built this whole image," she said bitterly. "Made me believe we were untouchable." "I believed it too," he replied. "That was the problem." Savannah walked through the penthouse slowly, the same place that once made her feel like royalty. Now it felt like a shell. Boxes lined the hallway, already half-packed by the staff. She wandered into the bedroom. opened the closet where designer dresses still hung like relics. And for a moment, she felt the sting of what she was losing, not just the luxury, but the illusion of value. She had mistaken borrowed power for her own. That afternoon, she left without slamming the door. She took only what belonged to her, what she had come with. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends, most of them curious, some pretending to be concerned. She ignored them. She wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Meanwhile, Elena received the news from her attorney in a brief phone call. "Savannah's out," the lawyer said. She walked away from him. "You were right. She wasn't loyal, just opportunistic." Elena didn't gloat. She sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea, staring at the morning light filtering through the window. She hadn't wanted to destroy Savannah. She wasn't even angry at her. The younger woman had been a symptom, not a cause. What mattered was that Graham's world was finally folding inward. His empire, his facade, his distractions, they were all peeling away, revealing the man he'd always been underneath. Later that day, Elena visited the office of a small nonprofit organization that supported women navigating financial abuse. She spoke with the director, a kind woman named Rosa, about setting up a grant in her father's name. "There are so many women," Elena said, "who sign things they don't understand, who trust men who don't deserve it, who give up their power without knowing what it costs. I want to change that." Rosa smiled. "You're not just reclaiming your own story. You're rewriting others." Elena nodded. "That's the idea." Back at the penthouse, Graham stood in the living room alone. He stared at the blank television screen, his reflection dim and ghostly in the black glass. The room was too quiet. No footsteps, no laughter, no presence except his own. The echo of Savannah's departure still lingered, a final severing of the last tie to the life he once curated. He picked up his phone, stared at Elena's contact, thumb hovering over the call button, then lowered it again. He didn't know what he would say. He wasn't sure there was anything left to say, but something inside him ached with a strange clarity. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the only person who had ever known him fully, and still stood beside him long after she should have walked away. And now, she had walked away for good. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in resolution. And there was no undoing that. In the span of a single week, everything Graham Westwood had spent 2 decades building began to disintegrate. The empire he once wielded like a weapon, built on branding, charm, acquisition, and intimidation, started falling apart not with a bang, but with a series of silent, merciless collapses. Every day, another crack appeared in the polished surface of his legacy, and no matter how desperately he tried to hold it together, the foundation had already been eaten away by arrogance, neglect, and the truth Elena had finally unleashed. The board met in private and voted unanimously to remove him as chairman. His name, once the core of the company's image, was quietly scrubbed from press releases, official bios, and internal documents. A new CEO was appointed, one of the younger executives Graham used to mock for being too cautious. He read the internal memo 3 times, each word hitting harder than the last. Effective immediately, Mr. Graham Westwood will be stepping down from all leadership positions. They didn't even include a quote from him, just a sterile, pre-approved line thanking him for his years of service. That was it. That was how they said goodbye. Banks followed next. Accounts frozen. Lines of credit suspended. His long-standing private wealth manager sent a politely worded email informing him they were re-evaluating their client portfolio. Suddenly, calls that used to be returned within minutes went unanswered. People who once flew across the world to sit at his table now refused to be in the same room with him. Even the boutique hotel in Aspen canceled his annual suite reservation. No explanation. No apology. Just unavailable for future bookings. The lawsuits came quickly. One investor filed for damages, citing misrepresentation of financial transparency. A second class action suit emerged from former employees who claimed they'd been misled during a company stock buyback orchestrated under Graham's watch. Regulatory agencies opened investigations. Emails were subpoenaed. Analysts debated on live television whether Graham would survive financially or if this would be the end of his career entirely. And through it all, Elena remained silent. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't defend herself. She didn't attack him either. She let the world do what it always does with crumbling giants. Watch in fascination as they fall. One afternoon, Graham walked into the lobby of his corporate headquarters, what used to be his headquarters, and was stopped at the front desk. The receptionist, a young man who clearly recognized him, offered an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, Mr. Westwood. Your credentials have been deactivated. I'll need to check with security." Graham stared at him, disbelief turning into quiet fury. "You're joking." The young man swallowed hard. "No, sir. Policy." He waited 10 minutes in that lobby, surrounded by people who used to nod at him with reverence. Now they avoided eye contact. When security finally arrived, they escorted him out, not forcefully, but firmly. One guard whispered, "I'm sorry, sir," as the elevator doors closed. But that didn't soften the humiliation. It amplified it. He went home that evening to an apartment, not the penthouse, which now legally belonged to Elena, but a rented space arranged in a panic by his assistant before she, too, resigned. The place was modern but hollow. No history, no identity, just clean walls and silence. He poured himself a drink, sat on the cold leather couch, and tried to feel something other than numb. Outside, the city pulsed as always, but it no longer seemed to belong to him. The world had moved on. His phone rang only twice that night. The first was from a journalist he used to court with exclusives, now asking for comment on his fall. He declined the call. The second was from his mother. He let it go to voicemail. He couldn't bear the sound of disappointment, not even from her. The only name he searched that night was Elena's. He found her on a financial podcast, speaking as a guest about the importance of legal literacy in marriage. She didn't mention him by name. She didn't need to. Her voice was calm, steady, articulate. She spoke not from anger, but from purpose. "Financial knowledge is power," she said. "Too many women give it away without realizing the cost. I was one of them, but not anymore." Graham watched the entire episode twice. Not to hate her, not to plan retaliation, just to hear her speak. To see her as she had become, poised, strong, untouchable in a way he never imagined. And it occurred to him, for the first time, that maybe she had always been this person. He had just never cared to see it. The next day, his lawyers informed him that Elena had been granted full control of the shared marital holdings. The company, the penthouse, the shared investments, the residuals from patents, everything under joint ownership was now hers. The hidden offshore accounts had triggered the clause, and the judge had ruled in her favor. It was done. He laughed bitterly after the call, not because it was funny, but because it felt surreal. The prenup he'd once dismissed, the woman he'd once ignored, the truth he'd buried. All of it had risen together and carved his name off the door of his own legacy. And she hadn't screamed. She hadn't threatened. She hadn't even needed to raise her voice. She had dismantled him with facts and patience. And now, there was nothing left to negotiate. He received a certified letter the following week. It was from Elena's legal counsel, notifying him of the final transfer of all assets. Attached was a personal note, handwritten. Just one line. "You taught me silence. I just gave it back to you." He folded the letter and placed it in his drawer, the only drawer that wasn't empty. He stared at it for a long time, wondering if she would ever speak to him again, wondering if he even deserved it. Outside, life went on. People still walked the streets, still laughed in cafes, still held hands and made plans. But Graham sat alone, surrounded by the ghosts of what he once had, no longer at the top of the world, but somewhere near the bottom, learning how it felt to be left with nothing but the echo of everything he thought would last. The courtroom was quieter than usual on the day Graham returned, this time without the entourage, without the tailored suit that once screamed status, and without the smirk that used to curl at the edge of his mouth. He sat on the defendant's bench alone, his lawyer beside him, but no longer speaking with the same clipped confidence as before. The man who had once leaned back in his chair with a posture that dared anyone to challenge him now sat forward, shoulders drawn in, fingers nervously interlocked. His tie was crooked. His shoes, once polished to a mirror shine, were scuffed from pacing. And for the first time in public, Graham Westwood looked like a man who knew he had lost. The judge entered with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the proceedings, but there was a new weight in the room now. Everyone knew this wasn't just a divorce case anymore. It had become something larger, a symbol of reversal, of accountability, of the idea that no matter how high someone rises, they are never above the truth. Reporters filled the gallery, pens poised, cameras barred by the court, but imaginations already spinning. Elena was not present this time. Her lawyer represented her interests. She didn't need to witness the final scene in person. She had already delivered the performance of a lifetime without ever stepping into the spotlight. The judge cleared his throat and began reading the findings in a voice that was neither cruel nor warm, just exact, like the ticking of a metronome. After thorough review of the financial records, the prenuptial agreement, and corroborating evidence presented by Mrs. Westwood's counsel, this court finds Mr. Westwood in violation of disclosure obligations. The fraudulence of omitted accounts and the intent to mislead materially impacts the division of assets. Graham closed his eyes. He had heard it before, in writing, through his legal team. But hearing it spoken aloud was something else. It was final, real, unavoidable. As stipulated in the prenuptial agreement, full control of marital assets, including but not limited to jointly held property, investment portfolios, and business shares legally registered to both parties, shall transfer to Mrs. Westwood, effective immediately. Furthermore, the court refers this case for review by the Financial Crimes Division regarding possible further investigation. The words settled over him like ash. He had thought he could prepare for this, but the sting of those sentences, each syllable carving away another piece of his pride, left him raw. There was no one left to blame, no angle to play, no room to maneuver. After the session ended, the gallery cleared out quickly, whispers trailing like shadows behind each spectator. Graham didn't move. His lawyer eventually nudged him to stand, and they left the room slowly, the air thick with the judgment of silence. Outside, reporters swarmed, but he kept his head down, ignoring the questions hurled at him. Mr. Westwood, do you have a statement? Is it true she now controls everything? Will you face criminal charges? Do you regret the way you treated your ex-wife? He said nothing. His car wasn't waiting. His assistant hadn't confirmed the schedule. There was no one to shield him, no team to deflect. Just him and the echo of everything he'd once owned being handed to the woman he thought he'd buried in court. He walked back to the temporary apartment, barely noticing the honks, the blur of pedestrians, the shifting gray sky overhead. It began to rain, and he didn't cover his head. The water mixed with the sweat on his skin, the suit growing heavy, his steps slower with each block. By the time he reached the building, soaked and silent, he looked like a man who had been erased. In the elevator, he watched his reflection in the mirrored panel. It was unrecognizable. The posture, the gaze, the loosened tie, it all spoke of a man stripped bare. When he opened the door, the apartment was just as he had left it, bland, beige, cold. He sat on the edge of the bed, still in wet clothes, staring at the wall. There were no photos here, no mementos, no signs that a life had ever been lived inside these walls. And maybe that's what he deserved. A space as empty as the version of himself he now had to confront. He didn't drink that night. He didn't call anyone. He didn't pace or write or scream. He just sat, watching the rain trace streaks down the window, wondering what came next when there was nothing left to protect. He thought of Elena, not with anger, not even with shame, but with something closer to awe. She had outmaneuvered him without raising her voice. She had reclaimed her place not by forcing the door open, but by waiting until the walls he'd built fell in on themselves. And now she held everything, not out of revenge, not because she wanted to take from him, but because she had finally stopped giving. And without her to absorb his storms, his world had no foundation. He remembered the last words she'd spoken to him directly on the day of the asset freeze. Maybe you were never really looking. And she was right. He hadn't looked at her. Not really. Not at her mind, her patience, her quiet strength. He'd seen her as background. Steady, predictable, safe. And because of that, he had mistaken silence for softness, restraint for submission. That had been his greatest failure. Not what he hid, but what he refused to see. He stayed like that for hours, unmoving, the city outside growing darker, then lighter, then dark again. Time didn't seem to apply anymore. He wasn't building, competing, thriving. He was sitting in a space of consequence, surrounded by the ghost of a man who once believed no one could touch him. And now, touched by truth, he had nothing left but the echo of a courtroom and the memory of a woman who had walked away, not in rage, but in triumph. There was a stillness in Elena's life now that felt different from the silence she'd once known. It wasn't the strained, loaded quiet of sitting across from a husband who only looked up from his phone to dismiss her. It wasn't the quiet of swallowing frustration during dinner parties or the stillness of waking up in a cold bed while Graham made deals in other time zones. No, this silence felt earned. It was the calm after a storm she never started but somehow endured, and it hummed with the steady rhythm of purpose. The court ruling had closed one chapter, but Elena knew the real work had just begun. She now controlled an empire she never asked to inherit, one that had been built on transactions she hadn't sanctioned and power plays she never respected. But she didn't want to dismantle it. That would have been too easy. What she wanted was to reshape it, to realign it with the values Graham had long since abandoned. She had the resources now, the reach, the platform, and she wasn't going to waste a second of it. Her first act was rebranding the parent company. The name Westwood Innovations disappeared from the website, signage, and press kits. In its place came the Richards Foundation, a nod to her late father, the man who had quietly taught her about ethics, foresight, and the power of knowledge. The move shocked the market. Analysts scrambled to understand what direction the new leadership was taking. Investors hesitated at first, then cautiously returned, intrigued by Elena's clarity and lack of theatrics. She didn't try to be Graham. She didn't mimic his style or rhetoric. She led in her own way, measured, sincere, transparent, and that turned out to be exactly what the business world was craving. She brought Margot in as chief financial officer. The woman who once passed her a USB drive in a quiet cafe now sat at the head of financial strategy meetings, mapping out reforms and ethical investing practices. Elena's old university friend, now a respected attorney, joined the legal team to rewrite contracts with accountability clauses and gender parity goals. Within 6 months, the company's public perception had undergone a dramatic shift. What had once been seen as a soulless tech conglomerate was now positioning itself as a force for ethical entrepreneurship, supporting initiatives that empowered women, especially those rebuilding after financial or emotional abuse. In a sleek downtown office that used to belong to Graham, Elena hosted her first press conference as CEO. The reporters expected a spectacle, maybe a veiled jab at her ex-husband, some bitter declaration wrapped in corporate diplomacy. But what they got was far more disarming. She spoke not about Graham, but about the culture that allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. She talked about how silence isn't weakness, how patience can be a weapon, and how dignity is the quietest but most enduring form of power. "My goal isn't revenge," she said. "It's redemption. Not just for me, but for the systems we've built that reward volume over value, noise over nuance, and arrogance over empathy. I believe we can do better. And we will." The statement went viral, not because it was loud, but because it felt true. Later that week, Elena visited a local high school as part of a new outreach program. She stood in front of a group of teenage girls, some curious, some bored, some visibly skeptical of another adult telling them how to succeed. But when she shared her story, not the scandal, not the courtroom victory, but the quiet unraveling of self-worth over years of being overlooked, something shifted in the room. They listened. They asked questions. And when one girl asked, "Was it worth it?" Elena paused for a long moment before answering. "It wasn't about worth," she said. "It was about truth. About knowing who you are even when someone else tries to erase it." The girl nodded, and Elena felt something settle in her chest. Not closure, not victory, just peace. At home, she now lived in a modest townhouse on a quiet street, far from the glossy towers she once floated through like a ghost. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to impress. It was warm, personal, hers. Bookshelves lined the walls. Photographs of her daughter hung near the fireplace. She cooked her own meals again, sometimes burning the rice, sometimes getting it just right. The stillness of those evenings, the clinking of a spoon against a coffee mug, the rustle of pages turning, they were small things. But they were real, and they were hers. Her daughter came home from college during a long weekend and found Elena at the kitchen table reviewing grant proposals. She plopped down across from her with a grin. "You're such a boss now," she teased. "People are scared of you." Elena laughed softly. "Good. They should be scared of women who pay attention." Her daughter leaned in. "Seriously, though? Are you happy?" Elena looked around the room. It was simple, unadorned. But in that simplicity was everything she had once been told she didn't deserve: respect, agency, peace. "I'm still figuring it out," she said honestly. But for the first time, I feel like I'm building something I actually believe in. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting golden light through the window panes. There was no audience, no applause, no stage, just a woman who had survived a war she never declared, now standing tall in the quiet aftermath, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had finally taken her place. The courtroom was nearly empty the final time Graham and Elena crossed paths under the same roof. There were no reporters, no murmurs of anticipation in the gallery, no dramatic stares exchanged between rival legal teams. Just a few rows of empty benches, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the smell of fresh paper and polished wood. It was a simple administrative hearing, a formality really, nothing more than the last box to check on a process that had already reshaped both of their lives. But for Graham, it felt like the final nail in a coffin carved out of his own blind confidence. He sat at the end of the long wooden table, no lawyers beside him this time. He wore a simple gray suit that didn't quite fit his frame anymore, his shoulders slightly slouched, his hands clasped tightly in front of him as if holding himself together. There was no swagger, no arrogance, just silence and fatigue. When Elena entered, she didn't walk with triumph. She walked like someone who knew exactly where she was going and exactly why. Her hair was pulled back, her suit tailored, her expression calm. She didn't glance at Graham as she passed by him to take her seat. She had made her peace long before this moment. The judge, a different one this time, flipped through a small stack of documents before nodding. "All filings have been verified," he said plainly. "The full transfer of joint assets is confirmed. No additional appeals have been filed. Per the original prenuptial agreement and subsequent rulings, all remaining holdings, real estate, shares, investments, will officially transfer to Mrs. Elena Richards, effective today." He paused, glancing at both parties. "Is there anything further either party would like to add for the record?" Elena shook her head softly. "No, Your Honor." The judge turned to Graham. For a moment, he looked like he might speak. His lips parted slightly, and his throat bobbed as he swallowed. But no words came. After a few seconds, he shook his head. "No," he finally said, barely audible. The judge signed the final document with a quick flick of his pen. "Very well. This court is adjourned." Graham didn't move right away. He stared down at the table as the bailiff opened the door, waiting for them to leave. Elena stood and turned to go. As she passed him, something compelled her to stop, not for him, but for herself. She looked down at the man she had once loved, once trusted, once believed in. A man who had, without ever striking her or raising his voice, made her feel smaller every day until she had forgotten her own weight in the world. He looked up, eyes hollow but searching. There was no bitterness left in her gaze, just clarity. "I never wanted this," he said quietly. "I didn't think you had it in you." Elena didn't smile. She didn't soften. She simply looked him in the eye and replied, "That was always your problem, Graham. You never thought I had anything in me unless it served you." She didn't wait for a response. There was none that could matter now. She walked through the door and into the hallway, her heels clicking with quiet purpose against the polished tile. Outside, the sky was clear, the sunlight warm, the breeze carrying just a hint of spring in the air. The city moved around her, fast and loud as always, but it no longer felt like it was passing her by. She wasn't on the sidelines anymore. She was setting the pace. A driver waited by the curb, door already open. As she approached, she passed a small group of young women in professional attire, laughing as they stepped out of a cafe. One of them recognized her and offered a polite nod. Elena nodded back. The recognition no longer startled her. She had stepped out of the shadow of her husband's name and built something that bore her own. And people were noticing, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. Inside the car, she received a message from Margot. "The foundation launch is officially set. Full house expected. Press already RSVP'd." Elena typed a quick reply. "Perfect. Let's make sure we highlight the mentorship programs. I want that to be the heartbeat." The driver pulled away from the courthouse, and Elena looked out the window at the city as it unfurled beside her. For the first time, she saw it not as something she had survived, but as something she now shaped. The company was hers. The name was hers. The mission, the momentum, the movement, it all bore her imprint now. And she wasn't afraid of the weight. She welcomed it. That evening, She returned to her townhouse and found a package waiting at her door. No return label, just her name written in neat block letters. She brought it inside, opened it slowly. Inside was a framed photo, an old one from years ago. It was from their wedding. Graham's arm was around her, both of them beaming, unaware of the future that awaited them. For a moment, Elena stared at the faces in the photo, two people who had no idea how fragile love could be when one person believed they could own it. She set the frame face down in a drawer and walked into the kitchen to make tea. The kettle whistled. She poured the water, stirred in honey, and carried the cup to her desk where blueprints and proposals lay waiting. Her daughter's handwriting was scribbled in the corner of one sheet. "Proud of you, Mom." Elena smiled and sipped slowly. The world hadn't changed overnight. There was still work to do, still stories to shift, minds to open, systems to challenge. But now she had the power to do it. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she had taken it back. And in the quiet of that moment, surrounded by the hum of a new life being built, she whispered to no one in particular, "I don't want the throne, just the room to move." This time, no one was going to take it from her.